Beyond surpass, profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Now we can see and hear it, accept and maintain it. May we unfold the meaning of the Tathagata's truth. Good morning.
Good morning.
I guess I have to put this over here, don't I? This is where this is
Don't
supposed
ask
to
me.
go. Okay. I have been talking on the intersection of our practice, Zen and Buddhism and art. And my background is in art. I was a painter here at IU. I still feel like an artist. I guess I still describe myself as an artist. But I've basically been giving a book report. Isan turned me on to this book, Where the Heart Beats. It's by Kay Larson. She is a Buddhist. The subtitle is John Cage's Zen Buddhism and the Inner Life of Artists. Kay Larson studied with John Daido Loori. I think she is practices some kind of Tibetan Buddhism at this point. I want to start out though by reading a poem. I found this wonderful book in a used bookstore, The Wisdom Anthology of North American Buddhist Poetry. So there's a lot of us out there apparently. In particular, Diane de Prima, who's one of my favorite Buddhist poets, but she wrote a poem for Suzuki Roshi. This is not for D.T. Suzuki, but I'm going to kind of say it is, because I have been talking about D.T. Suzuki's intersection with all these different artists that I'm coming across with this book. So, for Suzuki Roshi. After you died, I dreamed you were at my apartment. We ate soba together. You giggled and slurped a lot. You said, "Don't tell them I'm not dead," and pointed down the street towards the Zen Center. I don't want them to bother me. We laughed and drank the broth. I kept that promise. I think they still don't know. John Cage is a really fascinating fellow. And the more I read about him and the more I'm finding out about him. I knew him from my art history classes at IU and became fascinated by him at that point, but didn't dig that deep into who he was, what he was about. I've come to find out that there were so many people that are now famous that we know through the arts and through history and through, well, the intelligentsia of that time. They're now famous people. People like Joseph Campbell was a friend of John Cage's, and Alan Watts, many different artists. I think I mentioned Mark Tobey of the Dadaist, Marcel Duchamp, also Robert Rauschenberg later on. Also, Merce Cunningham, who was a dancer, a choreographer, had his own group. Cage met Cunningham in 1938 when Cunningham was still a teenager and dancing in his home state of Seattle in a studio that was set up there. And the sparks, I think, flew at that point, but of course nothing really happened around that. Cage was married at the moment. He was married to a Zinnia. I love the name. It was some years later, I think in the 40s, they kept meeting, kept coming together, started to have an ongoing affair over the years. And at some point in the late 40s, Cage was having a lot of guilt about this. He was not feeling very married to Zinnia, but he did have awful guilt feelings around it all. He couldn't, he could see the awful wreckage that he was going to make if he persisted, but he couldn't keep away from Merce Cunningham. But he couldn't imagine a future without him. So you can kind of guess that he was living in this, he was suffering. This went on for a number of years. I tend to think, and looking at the soup of the times and the directions he went, the kind of peace he was looking for in himself, sent him off in the direction of different kinds of spiritual philosophies and practices. The one I think that probably stuck through most was a sitting practice or Zen. He did look into a lot of the Indian philosophers. He looked at Meister Eckhart. D.T. Suzuki, of whom Cage was taking classes with and visiting lectures throughout this time in the 40s and 50s, along with his friend Alan Watts and Joseph Campbell. I forget what I was going to say, I'm sorry.
About D.T. Suzuki.
Yes, I know, but I forget what I was going to say about D.T. Suzuki. Forgive me, my nervousness is taking over here. So, you know what? I've got it right here. Yes. This is actually something that happened long after Cage was engaging D.T. Suzuki, but in going to his lectures, he was constantly coming up and asking D.T. Suzuki questions about practice. And at one point, Cage says, I went up to Suzuki after one lecture and asked him what he had to say about music. He said that he knew nothing about music and had nothing to say. I asked him what he had to say about art, and he said he had nothing to say about art either. Of course, this may have just been the Zen form of teaching by not teaching. At any rate, I got no help from him there and had to do my own thinking. And then he kind of goes on to say, then my next thought was, when he got to know him a bit, was if he would okay my music, then I would be hunky-dory. In other words, he wanted Cage to like his music. So I asked him one day, what do you have to say about music? And he said, I know nothing about music. I subsequently saw an interesting book that he wrote on the arts. But what he was saying in his teachings was, I will not give you any diploma, which is the correct Zen teaching. So I thought that was kind of interesting, especially with the way that this group of people revered Suzuki and what he had to say. And of course, D.T. Suzuki at that point was kind of the voice of Buddhism and Zen in America, especially for the Beats and people like these, like this swirl of artists around Cage. Okay, back to the collaboration. I'm leading up to a collaboration between Merce Cunningham and Cage. And Cage wrote the music for a dance play that, Cage wrote the music for a dance play that Cunningham wrote. It's called Four Walls. And I'm going to read a lot from this book because a lot of this is in Cage's words. Well, this is about Cage anyway. Cage's contribution to Four Walls occurred during a troubling time. Remember, he was in this relationship with Cunningham, and he was thinking about divorcing his wife, or I can't remember if he had actually divorced her at this point, but he was very troubled and feeling very guilty and awful. The music can be regarded formally as a piece characterized by repeating phrases and silences. It can also be interpreted as a raw confession of his seemingly impossible plight. As presented in 1999 at the Japan Society in New York, Four Walls persuasively declared itself to be a bittersweet love poem in which despair and anxiety intertwined with transcendent love. So this play actually wasn't from '99, which would have been after Cage's death. It was from, I think, about 1950, 49 or 50. I'd like to read a description of it, of the play. It's a dark stage. The piano is in the left corner with small golden lights on the score. Pianist Aki Takahashi enters and seats herself. She begins playing note clusters suspended between pauses of varying duration. Fingers trill a wistful melodic line. Stop, begin again. Stop, begin again. Stop, begin again, and begin again. The mood of gentle inquiry turns jagged, careless, urgent. The pianist alternates between the piano's upper and lower registers. The sense of foreboding and enclosure is palpable, as though the music is repeatedly banging up against something hard. Dancer Sin Cha Hong enters and paces deliberately through the cordon of light. She measures herself against the edges of her illuminated island. She crosses her arms, stares into the distance, sinks to the floor, bares her teeth and opens her mouth in a soundless cry. Turbulent and dissonant, the piano returns to the same phrases as though to a nagging thought that refused to be dismissed, hemmed in by its own relentless probing. The music is the counterpart of a restless heart, silence and darkness. Vocalist Lisa Bailiwa walks on stage. She stands poised and immobile in a spotlight for 18 bars. A long pause, a gathering. In a solo voice as clear as glass, she sings Cunningham's poem set to a melody as piercing, plaintive, and lyrical as medieval plain song. I'm not going to sing it. Sweet love, my throat is gurgling. The mystic mouth leads me so deftly, defted. My throat is gurgling. The mystic mouth leads me so defted. And the deep black nightingale turned willowy, and the deep black nightingale turned willowy, by love's tossed treatment bereft. She sings for less than 4 minutes, and then she stands motionless for another 7 bars. She leaves the stage. Next come 44 bars of rest, a full minute of silence and darkness, a true respite. But soon the piano again begins its pacing search of its confinement, claustrophobic, pounding like an aching head, asking. At last, one chord is set alone, tolling darkly like a bell, tolling 16 times. The dancer steps into a rectangle of light, a hand over her eye. The hand slides to her head, under her chin, covers her open mouth. Wide-eyed, agape, she steps out of the light. That's the performance in total. Kay Larson, the author of the book, sought out Aki Takahashi at one point to ask her about this. She says, just to encapsulate this, the repeating chords at the end of 4 walls, she said, evoke the bell that is rung each New Year's Eve in a Buddhist temple throughout Japan, tolling 108 times to atone for the past year's troubles and to begin again in the new year. And she adds, the silences were like ma, the Japanese word for the spaces between. Cage's involvement in Asian thought was still in its early stages, yet 4 Walls is prescient. It displays not only his disquiet, but also his dawning realization that the bondage caused by emotion, by ego noise, might have a solution. It's as though the composer had already begun to see that his raging mind could be cooled down by silence. So, I think what the author's trying to do is draw this line, and for me it is, well, from the talk last week I kind of gave the preliminaries on John Cage, and then here I want to eventually lead up to his famous 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Cage was asking so many questions of himself and getting so involved with, he just sounds like he was agitated and using that energy to find out his own spiritual path, at the same time using his art to get there. He wrote a piece, The Perilous Night. And this is about 1949, so it's right around the same time. And of course I have so many things here that I can't put my finger on it right now, so hang on one moment, please. Here we are. The Perilous Night premiered in New York on April 5th, 1944. The press's reaction to it were hostile and clueless. So we're coming from the 4 Walls into another experiment of Cage's, his response to the nasty reviews he got. He has written, "I had poured a great deal of emotion into the piece, and obviously I wasn't communicating this at all, or else, I thought, if I were communicating, then all artists must be speaking a different language, and thus speaking only for themselves. The whole musical situation struck me more and more as a Tower of Babel. The need to change my music was evident to me earlier in my life. I had been taught, as most people are, that music is, in effect, the expression of an individual's ego. Self-expression is what I had been taught. But then when I saw that everyone was expressing himself differently and using a different way of composing, I deduced that we were in a Tower of Babel situation because no one was understanding anybody else. For instance, I wrote a sad piece and people hearing it laughed. I was clearly pointless to continue in that way. So I determined to stop writing music until I found a better reason than self-expression for doing it." He goes on, "I got involved in Oriental thought out of necessity. I was very disconcerted, both personally and as an artist in the middle 40s. I saw that all the composers were writing in different ways, that almost no one among them, nor among the listeners, could understand what I was doing, so that anything like communication had a raison d'etre for art was not possible. I determined to find another reason. And I found those reasons because of my personal problems at the time, which brought about the divorce from Zinnia. I substituted the study of Oriental thought for psychoanalysis. In other words, it was something that didn't amuse me to grope with myself, but it was something I absolutely needed. I found that the flavor of Zen Buddhism appealed to me more than any other." So, through the suffering, he's starting to get an inkling. Okay. His influence through Asiatic philosophy, Hinduism, and in particular Ramakrishna. He actually worked with an Indian composer. I think it was at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. She was able to unpack Ramakrishna for him in a way that he hadn't been able to do for himself. But it was connected to an idea of God. So there is that idea of separation between the self and the God that's out there. So theosophy, something that we can all hold some theoretical hand and help us through our lives. But he was also reading Meister Eckhart, of which D.T. Suzuki had read quite a bit of and revered. In one of Suzuki's classes, there was a lady who said once, "I have great difficulty reading the sermons of Meister Eckhart because all the Christian imagery." Dr. Suzuki said, "That difficulty will disappear." I've never read Meister Eckhart, but I've always kind of been interested, and he pops up here occasionally, I think. Suzuki first read Meister Eckhart some 50 years earlier. He tells us around the time he was living in LaSalle, Illinois. Eckert impressed me profoundly, Suzuki writes, for I never expected that any Christian thinker, ancient or modern, could or would cherish such daring thoughts as expressed in those sermons. What is so daring? Eckert stands on his own experiences in describing the inner scenery of silence, Suzuki says. Eckert's universe arises out of nothing, Suzuki writes. It is not historical, not accidental, not at all measured. It goes on continuously without cessation, with no beginning, with no end. It is not an event of yesterday or today or tomorrow. It comes out of timelessness, out of nothingness, out of absolute void. In the spring of 1948, Cage was at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. He was there with many other artists. One in particular was Robert Rauschenberg, showed up at one point. Robert Rauschenberg studied under Joseph Albers. I actually have a second degree of separation connection to Joseph Albers. One of my teachers here at IU was one of his students at Yale University. So it was kind of interesting, another connection besides Gary Snyder coming here to study paleontology. So Robert Rauschenberg did a series of paintings. The white paintings. And the description sounds very similar to the way that Albers' color studies happened. I remember my teacher, in fact, two of my teachers had studied with Albers, now that I think about it. One of them taught color theory here at IU. He's still around town. But he had a very interesting and profound way of putting color and making color real and making the mechanics of it come around. Rauschenberg was interested in and did many different things. One thing in particular later in his life, he did a 1/4-mile long collage. I think the Museum of Modern Art has this at this point. He was a very interesting painter in my mind. He also did dance. They were described as the white paintings, silence, emptiness, whiteness, the voids, the void. These elements first materialized in the early 1951s with these paintings. In the Parsons show in 1951, he displayed a painting, Mother of God, now at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Rauschenberg laid down a base coat of white paint on a 48 by 32 inch piece of masonite. Then on top of 4/5 of the white ground, he pasted pieces of maps of American cities. Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, New Orleans, Boston, Denver, and so on. The twisting, spidery roadways, dark lines radiating across the white backgrounds, crackle with shivery linear energy. This frenetic activity is silenced at the picture's center by a great white circular void that hovers like a pulsing energy field. This void isn't empty, literally. It's a layer of brushed white paint that laps over the cut edges of the maps. Visually, the painted surface dematerializes into a humming whiteness. And I can imagine Cage, who was a painter, becoming friends with Rauschenberg. They apparently had, and stayed, they were friends their entire lives, but I guess they had really lively, wonderful conversations, and you can kind of see their connection. At this point, I think Cage is just starting to hatch in his mind the ideas about 4 minutes and 33 seconds. He's in New York. It's fall of '48. He's mostly broke most of the time. He had a favorite bookstore on one side of town that if he had the bus fare, if he could rake it together, he would go there and hang out all day. It was a bookstore full of Asian books. It's called Orientalia. And does it still exist?
I think the name changed and they recently closed, I think.
Too bad.
It's all online Amazon kind of thing.
The way of bookstores.
Yeah.
To his surprise, it moved to his neighborhood. And he made it his hangout. Mind you, this is 1950s, or late 40s, I said, into the 50s when it moved into his neighborhood. This is just after World War II, so there was a load of books that American soldiers and officers were actually harvesting from Japan and bringing to the store. So Cage had all this new stuff, way of thinking that he hadn't had before. He was also, he'd used it before, but he was getting into the I Ching as a composing tool. The idea of chance to create a work. He wrote 4 pieces based on some of Thoreau's writings, and I can't remember which ones. And then through the Zen philosophy, a la Suzuki, and the I Ching, let's see, more descriptions here. Cage always had measured his realizations in his music. And this moment is the axle of the wheel of his transformation. Cage can't see the long view at this point, but we can. As 1950 ends, he will learn to release the tight fist of ego by devising a radically new way of composing. Chance operations allowed Cage to dissociate his music from his inner turmoil. He will generate random numbers and use them to find sounds. How can he or anyone judge a sound that has arisen of its own accord? It rises and falls, appears and disappears, and has no ego content whatsoever. A single sound is like a thought, here 1 minute, gone the next. Each sound is free to be itself. Nothing can cling to it. No interpretation, no ideas, no anger, no hurt, no masterpiece, judgment, no not masterpiece, judgment. They proceed thus, by chance, by no will of their own, passing safely through the many perilous situations. So the idea is getting away from that idea of self-expression completely. And thereby no self-expression, no ego, nothing to connect it to. The art arises through the artist of itself, kind of detached, well, in fact, detached from the artist. This is connected to what I just said. Of course, Cage is dealing with these incredible strong emotions about Merce and about Zinnia, and wondering how to deal with them within his own life. Suzuki says, find a higher level of realization. Emotions are ordinary human events. They come with the territory. They can't destroy you unless you believe in them and give them power. Why believe in an illusion? The eggshell of the shell isn't solid or substantial. It has no reality apart from the oceanic ebb and flow of conditioned existence. When the shell is pierced, then you will know that emotions are just the play of light and shadow on the surface of the sea. Suzuki's teaching on ego was ground zero for Cage's transformation. Goes on to say, Cage says, emotions, like all taste and memory, are too closely linked to the self, to the ego. The emotions show that we are touched within ourselves, and tastes evidence our way of being touched on the outside. We have made the ego into a wall, and the wall doesn't even have a door through which the interior and the exterior could communicate. Suzuki taught me to destroy that wall. What is important is to insert the individual into the current, the flux of everything that happens. And to do that, the wall has to be demolished. Tastes, memory, and emotions have to be weakened. All the ramparts have to be raised. You can feel the emotion. Just don't think that it is so important. And if we keep emotions and reinforce them, they can produce a critical situation in the world. Precisely that situation in which all of society is now entrapped. There was a point in time when Cage became fascinated with anoechic chambers, or what's another word for them? Chambers where, silent chambers. They're devised in such a way with a material that won't reflect the sound around in the room, or the sound outside of the room does not infiltrate. So you're in there, and what you hear is kind of interesting. This is from a chapter called The Quietest Place from this book. This is around 1951. Cage says, and it appeared to me when I went through my work, or what was to become my work, that the experience I had had in the soundproof room at Harvard was a turning point. I had honestly and naively thought that some actual silence existed. So I had not really thought about the question of silence. I had not really put silence to the test. I had never looked into its impossibility. So when I went into that soundproof room, I really expected to hear nothing. With no idea of what nothing could sound like, the instant I heard myself producing two sounds, my blood circulating and my nervous system operating, I was stupefied. For me, that was the turning point. And it was, okay, there's a description of him doing this. Cage takes his seat in the anoechic chamber, and we invisibly take a seat alongside him, so we're imagining. The door softly shuts and he's alone here in the cozy, womb-like, absorbent walled chamber of nothing. And he's stunned. It's not what he's been expecting. Where's the silence? He's hearing a dull roar and a high whine. In this moment of voidness, Cage's ears fill up with sound. He rushes from the anechoic chamber and urges the engineer to explain. The engineer asks Cage to describe the sounds. Cage tells him. The high whine is says the engineer, is the firing of his neurons. The dull roar is the blood flowing through his veins. I'm going to go right into the performance of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. I'm not personally going to do this. I'm going to read a description of it. So it first happened at Black Mountain College. I need to be sure of this. Well, it's the first performance, wherever it is. Carolyn, Earl, MC, and John settle onto hard wooden benches and chairs in the Maverick. Behind them, the gambrel roof of the barn holds an arch of old window sashes, a homegrown Woodstock version, obviously he's at Woodstock, Woodstock version of the cathedral stained glass rose window. In the front of them is a small, shin-high stage, low enough so a performer can step up in one hop. Outside, the soft gray sky is sultry and threatening rain. Peeking at the program, the audience can see Cage's music listed twice. The first piece of the evening is identified simply by the date, later titled Water Music, a first cousin of Water Walk. It's scored for such noisemakers as duck call, 3 whistles, a deck of cards, water gurgling from containers, a radio, and a stopwatch. Cage had already presented this piece at the New School for Social Research in May and at the Black Mountain College on August 12th. Just before Cowell's The Banshee, the program lists a second work by Cage. So there are three works. The first is Water Music. The second is by another composer, John Cowell, a friend of Cage's. And then there's the third work by Cage, which is 4 minutes and 33 seconds. His friend, Tudor, I can't remember his first name, is the composer that he favors. I think his name is John Tudor.
David.
Beg your pardon?
David Tudor.
David Tudor. Cage sought this particular pianist out because he saw him as the one most able to play his music. And there are some of his music is very difficult to play. I mean, if you can imagine, there's no particular rhythms. It is cacophonous, it is random, and this guy can play it note for note, apparently. Okay, to play it, Tudor sits at the piano, sets out a stopwatch, carefully closes the keyboard lid, studies the score, and doesn't move for 30 seconds. He raises the lid and looks at the stopwatch. He carefully closes the lid, studies the score, and doesn't move for 2 minutes and 23 seconds. As wind gusts through the wide open doors at the rear of the hall and rain titters on the roof. He raises the lid and looks at the stopwatch. He carefully closes the lid, studies the score, and doesn't move for 1 minute and 40 seconds, while people mutter and rustle in their seats. He stands up and walks off stage. Cage dryly observes the interesting sounds people make as they walk out of the hall. That's it, not much, right? Then the aftermath begins. And that aftermath is the anger, the the nasty letters he got, private letters from people that thought he was playing them for fools. It's interesting that it was preceded with duck calls and all these other sounds, and then into this total silence. So you're kind of set up for hearing anything, in a way. It's also interesting that Cage did 3 versions of this. One of them I don't think, one of them that's very interesting is scored. This is the 3rd score. It was actually published by C.F. Peters in 1961. It's a single sheet of paper. At the top is a short text, kind of describing it. There is a Roman numeral 1. Then it says tacit.
What?
Tacit is the instruction in a score that tells one instrument to be silent in the midst of the sounding of the other instruments of the orchestra. It's the instruction in a score that tells one instrument to be silent in the midst of the sounding of the other instruments of the orchestra. So, number 1, Roman numeral 1, tacit. Movement 1, Roman numeral 2, tacit. And then Roman numeral 3, tacit. So, that is kind of a joke, but Cage was perfectly serious about this. It says, in creating several versions of the score, Cage must have known what he was doing. How could it be otherwise? He would understand that the score of 4 minutes and 33 seconds is as empty as the performance, that it could be written in many ways. The score of 4 minutes and 33 seconds is a proposition. It says in notational shorthand, stop for a moment and look around you and listen. Stop and look. Stop and listen. The roar of being never ceases. Cage has divided what can never be divided. We have to assume that he knew it couldn't be divided. He could have been aware that in 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he was making marks on the river of infinity. And I have one rather poetic description by Kay Larson of the performance. David Tudor walks across the stage and sits down with the boundaryless universe. Trying hard to say that. Boundaryless universe. He crosses his legs, so to speak, and begins an interval of non-doing. As the stopwatch ticks, he will perform nothing. And these 4 minutes and opening occurs. No expression of will or ego. No walls between composer and performer. No walls between the pianist and the people listening. No dualistic divisions into high or low, good or not good. No art versus life. No value judgments and no lack of value judgments. No arising and no lack of arising. No separation of any kind, no walls at all, and therefore perfect interpretation. No form, no lack of form, no emptiness, no absence of emptiness, no cessation, no lack of cessation, no music, and yet the music of the world. So remember, Kay Larson is a Buddhist. She knows, like we know, the Heart Sutra in and out. That was the Heart Sutra. I mean, what else was it? So I'm going to end with that and take any questions, comments. Yes?
Do you know why he chose 4 minutes and 33 seconds? as opposed to 4 minutes and 34 seconds or 5 minutes and 15
Boy, you'd have to ask him that. And I don't think you can at this point.
I can say a little bit about that,
Sure.
if I may. I have an old friend who wrote a book about Cage's music. And Cage was still alive when my friend was working on his book, and so he spent a lot of time with Cage, actually. And I was just looking at the book yesterday because I knew that Hosshin was going to talk about it today. And in the book it says that when he wrote this piece, and this was also reflected in the description that Hosshin read of the first performance, it is broken up into sections by the pianist closing the lid and so on. And Cage really, at that time, thought of the piece as having a structure so that there were these very precise durations within it that were different sections in his mind. And he arrived at those sections by adding smaller durations together. And I forget whether anyone knows how he arrived at the smaller durations, maybe using the I Ching or something. I don't know if he was using it at that time. Anyway, that was how he thought of it at that time. Later on, apparently during Cage's life, his idea about the piece changed a lot. And it became more one long stretch of time. Well, not very long, a little over 4 minutes, but
Yes?
I'm just kind of curious about the idea of the I Ching. I mean, do you know how he would use that? Would he throw sticks? I mean, and to determine, which hexagram, and then and kind of assign that a particular note, or how do you know?
I think he was using coins, and he was using a hexagram. I think he also used sticks. He also devised his own method of writing music to make it as much by chance as possible. A combination of squares, almost something like shape note singing, uses shapes. He was really casting about for any way to write music so that he could, this kind of goes back to my first talk, he could leave. He could not be there writing it. The music writes itself. There are a couple of descriptions of those things. I don't know how they really work, and I've never done the I Ching. I mean, I kind of know about it, so. Yes?
My sense is that we could have some understanding of his process and have some appreciation of his music. Whereas people who don't have an orientation from Zen or Buddhism or perhaps Meister Eckhart might not have any appreciation for what he's doing, what he's offering, the possibility of attending to an orchestra that has no particular single player. Does he offer a way in to his audience? Does he offer an orientation to those of us who are listening that might not have the same orientation that he does?
I think he was more interested in allowing the experience unfold on its own. He gave lots of lectures. I mean, a lot of people knew him. But I don't think he got up and talked about what he was going to do. I love the idea of the surprise of the audience, anybody sitting there, and expecting some kind of music to happen, something to happen. Something did happen. And the music did happen.
Yeah.
They just weren't listening in the right direction. So, yes.
It's a bit like me traveling in Buddhist clothes. Most of the time people look at me like, what the hell is this? And sometimes come to me like, are you like a martial artist? And sometimes conversation opens up and I say, no, I'm wearing this because I'm a Buddhist monk. And then conversation may start.
Yeah.
Most of the time message doesn't go. But sometimes people are attracted to, for some elements of that, and then conversation starts. It's something like that. First of all, I have to say, I truly enjoyed being in Summer Ango with you this time. And I truly appreciate that you were Shuso this time. And you're very patient, and you're so very sincere, and you're very diligent. And at the beginning of the Ango, we actually created a covenant, so to speak. And we were silent in the morning, silent in the evening, and during the day we had our own program back to back. But I truly enjoyed this conversation. You always talked about the Dharma-based conversation when we were together. But I believe this book actually came out of our private conversation. The reason I knew this book was a few years ago I was in San Francisco. I spent quite a lot of time in San Francisco with Norman Fisher's group. I hope everybody knows who Norman Fisher is. He used to be the head of San Francisco Zen Center, Green Gulch, Tassajara. And around that time, San Francisco Zen Center is the hub of Soto Zen in this country. And they are the first, actually, Buddhist monastery in this nation. But around the time he took over the position, I think they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And then he actually created so many interesting programs, attracted so many people, and then put into a very healthy organization. But anyhow, he has now a lay practice, left monastery, and he has a group called Everyday Zen. And Everyday Zen meets every Wednesday, like Hojo-san meets for study group. And about a few years ago, they actually took up this book as a textbook to study on Wednesday night. And that's how I got to know this book, and I was recommended to read.
Yes.
The purpose is, I think they are layered, but I highly recommend to read this book because it's a great pendant book with Rick Field's How Swan Came to the Lake, was that the title? That book really describes what Buddhist teacher came to this country and created what center. But I don't think that explains how people here in the United States come to Buddhism. I come from Japan, and I grew up in a typical Buddhist town. So I was always interested how on earth people in America ever interested in Buddhism. And Paul and I have rooted our lives in New York City. And this is like 100 times larger than Bloomington. And interestingly, there are 3 major Zen centers, and I got to know 3 of them very intimately. I was actually a board member of 2 of them. And statistically, it's quite true. Large group of people actually come from some inspiration they got from some form of art. It's probably because of the nature of New York City, because it's a hugely artistic town. But I think there's something about it. It's really those group of people the book describes. By the way, this book is not about John Cage. It is about how Buddhism comes and influences those very influential artistic, creative people in all areas. Writers, music, dancers, etc., etc. And then they deliver their message that they got inspired by Buddhism. And audience starts to question, what the hell was that? And they start to discover the resource of it, and they come to Buddhism. And it was statistically true in New York City. So I thought that was very interesting. And then I think Norman himself, being a writer, a part of the Beatnik movement, and all of his friends are described in that book. Maybe he also wanted to send that message as well. Art is important.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's how culturally Buddhism comes to the United States.
yeah.
That's the message of that book. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yes, yes. It is kind of unique. I mean, I think about the people that end up here. Many people are dancers, musicians, a lot of musicians, painters, artists of all kinds. Not too many lawyers, you know. So.
Bankers.
One more thing, sorry, I just need that. And many of those quotations are modern American Zengo. Zengo is a Zen word which is Japanese language is studied with those short expressions. Sometimes we use this so customarily we don't even know where it comes from, what it means. You know, like every day is a good day,
Yeah.
or illuminate your footstep, or ichigo ichie, one time one meat. All of those are traditional Zen words. But that book actually is trying to create new American Zen words. And Norman loved that 2 episodes you put out, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And also, I forgot the English word, I'm sorry. John Cage goes to this room, I believe it's Harvard University created that, whatever the room is called.
Oh, anechoic chamber.
Right.
Yeah.
And then he discovered what exactly is the absolute silence is. And there's a very interesting liner about that.
Yeah.
And those are like our modern American Zengo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very inspirational words.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
We actually have an anechoic chamber in Bloomington.
We do.
Yes, and I've been in it.
Yeah.
It's really old and kind of falling apart, but it's on 17th Street. And so you can't really go in it unless you know someone. Anyway, the main thing I wanted to ask you is, after all this, you know, these talks and so on, what you think the arts are good for, in a way. And I'm asking that partly because I saw an article that Scott Russell Sanders wrote for Bloom magazine. It was a few months ago, where he was interviewing 3 local poets. Some of you may have seen this. And one of them was Ross Gay.
Yes.
And I was really struck by the page that was the interview with Ross Gay. One of the things he said, Ross Gay, was that, well, Scott Sanders asked him, why do you write poetry? It's kind of like, what's it good for? You know? And Ross Gay said that he thinks of it as a spiritual practice. And so I wondered, does that resonate for you at all? Or what do you think about this question of what are the arts good for? Because many times I think people feel that the arts are a frill. You know, they're not really essential. Medicine is essential. Science is essential, and so on.
I think arts are essential, actually. And I think you can look at it as a spiritual practice. I mean, I think about when I was practicing art, practicing painter, and you know, I go back to that thing I keep saying about coming into your studio, casting off the world, and eventually all you're left with is you and the painting, and if you're lucky, you leave too. So it's just the painting, so it kind of comes back to this. But I think that if you're doing art, rather than self-expression, it's a kind of self-examination. And that immediately talks about Dogen's comment to me before, before I knew to study the ways to study the self. To study the self is to get the self, so on and so forth. So if it's not, if you're not really examining yourself in your arts, you're just doing crafts. Whatever your practice is, I think you cannot help, if you're really intently doing it, examining yourself. Why you do it, why you screw it up, why you try and fix it, why you try and salvage it, why you try and go different directions, why you pour yourself into it, and why you bang your head on the wall. It's all the same thing, I think. So I think it's important. It's necessary. And for a lot of artists, poets or painters, musicians, they would say, how can I not do what I do? I may not paint anymore, but I feel like a lot of the things I do are still art, are still...
Well, I'd like if you could say more about that. I mean, I know that in your carpentry work, you're often designing, and so that seems to be very creative, and then there's also building things, which is creative. Do you see a difference between those activities and the painting that you used to do, or do you think they're really similar?
They're really similar and they're really different. In both, there is this period, maybe less so in my work, but more so in the art, where you are struggling to find where something is going.
So there's a kind of openness that you have. Okay.
I mean, most days it takes me a full hour just to kind of get my head around what work I'm doing. But once I get rolling, as painting or with carpentry or whatever, when I get rolling, that's when I forget about everything else and I just do what I'm doing. And all of a sudden you realize that you have just moved from point A to point B in a kind of effortlessness. And so then I can think about something I talked about a while back, about dukkha as being stuck and sukha as flow. So in work and in art, there's that sukha time when you're flowing and you're just doing. You're not suffering because you're just doing. You're just flowing with what's going on. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
What you just said there reminded me very much of excuse me, what Dogen says about being out on the ocean in a boat. In a sense, we're sort of at the mercy of the wind and the waves, but at the same time, there's rowing. So there's sort of, your effort to do something, to get started, to get it warmed up or whatever. And then there's also the ocean, the waves and the wind that are sort of carrying it. So it's not just one or the other. I think it's like a collaboration between effort and conditions.
Yes, yes. That's true. We carry so much stuff all the time. And I think art's kind of an opportunity to drop that stuff off. So's Zazen, Or for me, there's always a point in sesshin where it's like I just want to scream, get up and get out of there, And it doesn't last very long, very short kind of thing. And the next moment, I'm just kind of settled with it. It's what it is. And I think it's the same with making art or enjoying your work.
It also kind of reminds me of Dogen's words about, sometimes we turn the Dharma wheel and sometimes the Dharma wheel turns us.
Yeah.
And so it's always these two modes in our practice, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Some would argue we never turn the Dharma wheel. It always turns
Yeah, the
us.
Dharma wheel turns the Dharma wheel, but that's the third, that's the more holistic.
Yeah.
Other times you're just the wheel turning. Other times you're just the wheel turning.
What's the difference?
To go first?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Sure.
So I get a parallel between 433 and Zazen, and to where in both instances you're opening yourself up to the world. But in both instances, there are people that are frustrated and writing nasty letters. So, as Shuso, do you have skillful suggestions for those in their practice who occasionally write nasty letters to themselves and their zazen of, this is not what I thought it was going to be?
To themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I
Because we come at this with an expectation.
well, from my own karma. I mean, I grew up in a very German family and judgmental family. I mean, what family life is. Our family wants us to be something, but I do a really good job of beating myself up about the things I do and not doing them very well. And there are times, and I think actually this practice, and something I was trying to say before, that's a habit of mind. This practice allows us to see the habit of mind and actually suspend it at times, and to see the workings as just that. It's not the reality. It's just what our minds do. And it's hard to have compassion for ourselves. But I guess that's what I would want to encourage. That we work hard to have compassion for ourselves, because that means we can have compassion for others.
Speaking as a person from a Germanic family like that,
Yeah.
I completely understand. Thank you.
Also, I'm sorry for really changing the course of the conversation, but I wanted to go back to that art. So there are so many stories about the people getting inspired by sutras, like Six Dances Dajurinan, and our teacher Hojo-san being inspired by Richard Roshi's book. It's a famous story. But I think many of us actually do get the inspiration not from theology or books or sutras. I ended up becoming a very heady person. So during the Ango, my project was preserving the teaching. So I spent 6 hours and 7 hours each day during the Ango, transcribing, translating, proofreading, etc., etc. But I don't think that's really all about it. For instance, when I was a child, I was born and raised in this quintessential Zen town called Kamakura. So once you step out of your door, everything is temple. But what inspired me was like, you take a look at the stone garden and you say, as a child, why does this garden doesn't have water? And then someone comes to you and they explain. And you sit in a large Dharma hall, and it's a sliding door, as you mentioned in the lecture 1 and lecture 2. Inside, outside freely changes. And I'm sitting as a child, and this is so cold. Why don't they close that door? And someone comes to me and explains to me. And something about that kind of inspires, like, oh, what does that mean? And I think, come to looking back, what I heard as a child from those older people, they're actually talking about the Dogen. So it takes a little while, but the inspiration is everywhere. And also, in my hometown, many of those gardens are created by Buddhist priests. A famous guy called Shuso, he was a national teacher. And invited from Kyoto to Kamakura and created some very famous gardens. But he was actually a gardener. So therefore, he was someone like you who expresses his messages or understanding or compassion in the form of creating garden or gardening, so to speak. And 800 years later, I get inspired by what he creates. So it's really interesting when you actually talk about art. The image is like a framed painting, but it's actually not what we're talking about. So I thought that was very interesting. You picked up that subject all the way through. Oh, so in another word, both Paul and I actually created a livelihood out of arts. But I switched into arts at the how to sit at the bedside. But I still think what I'm doing at the bedside with people who have terminal illness is art,
Yeah.
as its expression.
Some would say, and I would concur, that art is life. I mean, I think it's when we're most human, maybe. Yes. I've been waiting for you to say something. Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else? Shall we do the 4 vows? I don't know how to shut this thing off. Is it just the red button?
Let me do that, thank you. Just press the red button, I believe.